The first operation of reassembly of the transmission is the installation of the lower reverse piston into the main case. We've already installed our piston O-rings and lubricated them with transmission fluid. And a special note on the 350 lower reverse piston, it has an alignment notch on it, a lug, which must be engaged into this recess in the case. By using even pressure all the way around the piston assembly and pushing straight back in the case, the piston will move back all the way in the bore. To make sure that you've aligned the alignment lug in its recess, take the piston by the outer lugs and try and rotate it. If it only moves a little bit and stops in each direction, it's properly located in the retaining lug. Now we need to replace all the piston springs and the spring cover and associated retaining ring. With all the springs located on their proper seats, we'll put our spring retainer on top of them, making sure they're all within the confines of the spring retainer. Install our spring compressor. And tighten it down. Continue compressing beyond the snap ring retaining groove. With that done, we need to reinstall the snap ring. With the retaining ring in place, we need now to back off on a compressor, remove the tool, and make sure that the snap ring, retaining ring, is within the retaining lugs of the spring retainer. With the lower reverse piston installed, next we'll install the rear shaft and rear thrust bearing. If we put some lube, assembly lube, on the back of the rear shaft in this area, it'll hold our bearing in place for us so it won't come out during assembly. We also want to put some lube, once again, on all supported shaft areas that go through bushings. Next, we have our reaction carrier, which once again has a bushing in it, needs to be lubed, and we should drip some transmission fluid on all the pivots, all the axles of the pinion gears. We don't want anything dry on startup. Next, we need to put our clutch pack in. We're going to start that with a steel plate because it goes up against the activating piston. These can only go in but one way, but that's the proper alignment for them. Next, we put in a friction disc and align it on the notches in the reaction carrier, followed by a steel, and then another friction plate until we replaced the same number of clutch pieces as we removed on this assembly. With the clutch pack installed, I want to draw your attention to this area of the case. This is in the bottom of the case, and if you notice, this one little lug has a rounded corner on it. That rounded corner is designed to receive this area of this anti-rattle spring. We place the anti-rattle spring in the case in this fashion, and then we install the pressure plate, which also houses the lower and reverse roller clutch. When we install this piece, the anti-rattle spring is going to give you a little bit of resistance, so you have to push straight back on it until it clicks into place. If we take a close look at the anti-rattle spring, you notice that the two tangs are protruding slightly beyond the pressure plate. This holds tension on the pressure plate and keeps it from rattling and giving us unwanted noise in the transmission. The last piece in installing our low and reverse clutch section is a retaining ring. And we want to install the retaining ring so that the open end will be encompassed by the retaining groove in the case for optimum strength. With our retaining ring in place, now it's time to put some assembly lube on the back of our thrust washer and install it back on the face of this reaction carrier partial assembly. And I'll put a little bit of transmission fluid on the face of the thrust washer. Now we can install our sun gear assembly, which is the final part of our reaction carrier assembly. Once again, make sure you put some lube on the bushings that are inside of it. And we just keep turning it till it seats all the way down and check for smoothness of operation. Next we have our output carrier. And once again, we want to lubricate this thrust bearing that's inside of here, plus all of our pinion bearings. So we're just going to dip this right in the transmission fluid. Make sure everything gets good and wet. Roll everything around, make sure the lubricant works in. And we're going to install this on the other end of our sun gear. It's time now to install a retaining snap ring on the output shaft, which retains the output carrier. If you recall, this was the little snap ring that was such a pain to get out. Fortunately, it's much easier to reassemble. You have to make sure, though, that it does seat all the way in its retaining groove. Next, we have our input carrier. We've already applied grease to the back of this thrust washer to hold it in place. Now we're going to apply grease to a support bushing and install that over the output carrier. Once again, checking for smoothness of operation. That is followed by the input shaft with the forward clutch. And as you recall before, we lined up all of our lugs, which will aid us in getting them to engage the matching flutes on the input carrier. And we have a little shaft here that's supported by a bushing, so we put a little grease on that. And to get this in, we're going to have to wiggle it while we turn it back and forth, and eventually all those little clutch plates will line up and the unit will lock down all the way in place. That gets followed by our direct clutch, which once again we've pre-aligned all of our friction disc lugs. And we have bushings here that need to be lubricated. This has to be assembled so that all of these lugs engage on the clutch plates. Then these large outer lugs engage in the shell on the sun gear. The same techniques can be used as before. And there it is in place. Next, we need to install our intermediate band. The band has two distinct mounts on it. This one, which has basically a square cut groove in it, which is going to locate in a tab in this part of the case, and a more rounded end with a detent in it, which will be engaged by an accumulator piston. We need to put this in around the hub and just lay it in the case. This is how it will look with the band located in the retaining lug of the transmission case. Now it's time for the intermediate clutch pack. It starts with a pressure plate with a flat face facing towards the outside of the transmission, as opposed to the beveled face, which faces toward the back of the transmission, being installed in the case in this location. And after that, we have to start with our friction disc, and then a steel and a friction and a steel until they're all installed. Once again, we're replacing the same number of clutch pieces as were removed during disassembly. Once the last steel has been in place, we need to install that wavy cushion washer, which will actually mate up against the intermediate piston that's in our front pump assembly, which comes next. The gasket paper, so it will seal better. We also want to apply some transmission fluid around this area of the case to assist the O-ring on the pump housing during installation. Now it's time for our front pump assembly. We've already lubed all the bushings inside of the pump assembly. We've also lubed the O-ring that seals the pump body to the outside of the case. It's also a good practice to use some assembly lube on all these hook type sealing rings. The pump, like the gasket, must align properly with the ports in the case. Before pushing the pump all the way into the case, we want to look through the mounting holes and make sure that they're lined up properly with the bolt holes in the case. If they're not at this time, it's easy to align it with a drift pin or a small rod. Before installing the front cover to case bolts, the sealing washers under the heads should be removed and replaced with the new ones in your overhaul set. This will assure you that you won't have any leakage out of the front of the case after installation. These bolts should also have their threads lubricated with assembly lube so that they don't overstress the aluminum case. Once all the bolts have been brought up finger tight, we can take the end of our hammer handle and by working around, gently tap the pump further into the case to engage the sealing O-ring. The pump body should be in far enough now that you can finish drawing it into place using the bolts. If you're careful only to draw it in a little bit at a time, go across the case, draw it a little more, back across the case, draw it a little more, so you're drawing it in evenly and gently. You don't want to cock the pump in the case, and it shouldn't be difficult to turn any of these bolts. They should go very freely. If not, something is incorrect, you should remove the pump and find out what your problem is. With all the bolts snug down, we can now torque the front pump into the case with a torque wrench. And on this model transmission, going to go to 18.5 pounds. That's what's recommended from General Motors. And we're going to do this by going alternately across the face of the pump to spread the tension until all bolts have been checked with a wrench, and then we'll go back over them one more time to make sure nothing is settled. Next, we want to check for freeness of rotation of our input shaft, and we want to check end play. With the front pump properly torqued to the main case, it's time to check end play of the input shaft. To do this, you'll need to set up your dial indicator with if it has a magnetic base off of a metal plate bolted to the bell housing, with a point of the indicator lined up onto the end of the input shaft. By drawing forward on the input shaft, we can record the movement of our indicator, which dictates the amount of end play of the input shaft. We're registering 25 thousandths end play, which is acceptable for this transmission, which is supposed to be between 10 and 45 thousandths end play. If your end play is not enough, you'll have to put thinner thrust washers in underneath the pump assembly. Consequently, if the end play is too great, you need a thicker selective washer underneath the thrust washer behind the pump. The seal for your manual selector shaft can be installed now. We're just going to lay the seal in the cavity on the case by using a 1/2 inch socket lined up straight, coming down on it easily. Once it's installed, all that's left is to wipe a little bit of assembly lube onto the seal so it's not dry during the rest of assembly. Now it's time to reinstall the valve body. We've already replaced the seal on our band apply piston, but we're going to also put some transmission fluid in the bore, then install our spring and the rest of our valve. Just make sure that it will go down in the bore. Next, we have to reinstall our 4 check balls. And to make sure they stay put for us, I'm going to put a little dab of assembly lube in the areas that they rest in. Okay. This will assure us that they stay in location during final assembly. Once the check balls are properly located, we can reinstall our governor line screen, which goes in this passage right here, and our pump pressure screen, which goes in this cavity. Next, we need to install the main case to separator plate gasket, which we soaked in transmission fluid. And we want to line it up so none of the bolts will interfere with the gasket as they're installed. Next, we need our separator plate. We line that up. Then we need the separator plate to valve body gasket. This has also been treated with transmission fluid. We're going to line that up so the bolts won't interfere with the gasket. Now we're ready for the valve body itself. Lower it down in place. And we start putting our bolts in, which we're going to lubricate with assembly lube. With all the valve body bolts just finger tight, we want to use our special gasket from our shift kit, soak it in transmission fluid, and install the spacer support plate. Once again, all the threads of all the bolts will be lubed with our assembly lubricant. Once again, when torquing the valve body, you want to work from a center location and weave our way out to the outside. We should go back over all bolts one final time. That completes torquing the valve body and the support plate. Now we can put our manual linkages back in. We start off by putting this cover plate back over the parking pole. Now we can put our selector in place. Can install our manual selector shaft. We'll put a little lube on that. Along with the backing nut for that. Now we can tighten our retaining nut on our manual selector shaft. With the retaining nut tightened, we rotate our selector forward. This gives us room to install our link. And as we rotate it back into the case, we can now install our distance spring, which will keep our linkages connected. Now we can go back and tighten the parking pole cover plate. The park lock bracket can now be torqued to the recommended 29 pounds. With the bolt removed, we can now install the detent spring and roller assembly, put our bolt back in and retorque it to our 10 to 13 pounds as we've done previously. Now it's time to install our throttle valve linkage in this area. This is a connector that runs between the valve area up through the outside of the case to hook to your throttle valve cable. This rod gets inserted in this hole, in this end of our linkage. You pass it through the hole in the case, push this part up against the throttle valve, pushing it in, and install the pivot locking pin until it snaps into place. This should have free movement with the rod attached exiting the case. That completes installation of the throttle valve linkage on the inside of the transmission case. Now we can install our gasket and our transmission fluid filter. First, we'll take a little bit of assembly lube and apply it to the valve body where the gasket goes to hold it in place for us. Align the gasket. Line the filter up to the mounting holes and install the two retaining screws. Now we can install our oil pan gasket and oil pan. For the oil pan gasket, I like to use a light film of grease on both sides of the gasket. This allows the gasket to work its way into place and settle without cracking. I don't believe in using all kinds of silicone sealers and stuff on the oil pan, because if you use too much and any of it gets inside, it can ruin your transmission. With the gasket in place now, we'll put a film of grease on this side of the gasket. With the oil pan bolts torqued to specification, in our case it's 10 to 13 foot-pounds, same as a valve body, we can now turn the transmission over and continue working on it by installing our governor, accumulator, piston and cover, and extension housing. Before installing the governor, we need to apply some assembly lube to these areas and the driven gear. This assures us that before we develop oil pressure, the governor won't be running dry. Now you need to just insert it into the housing and let it rotate itself into position. Now we're going to install the governor cover. We've already put our new O-ring on it and applied some assembly lube to it. We place it over and with a hammer lightly tap it into place, hitting on these areas alternately to bring it in smoothly without denting the cover. Once this flange of the cover is seated snugly against the case, we need to install the locking hasp, which drops down the top hole in the case, and the bottom end swings back and snaps in on the bottom of the case, securing the governor cover. Next, we can install the modulator valve and the modulator. Don't forget, because we put a shift kit in this transmission, we have to put the shift kit spring on the modulator valve before we install it. We've also coated the modulator valve with a light film of transmission oil. Push it on the valve and let it release back to you. Make sure that it moves freely. We've coated the O-ring on our modulator with assembly lube, and we just press that in the case behind the valve. Need to install our modulator retaining clamp and accompanying bolt, which once again we've lubricated the threads with the assembly lube. And this bolt you can just tighten snug plus a little bit, about 10 pounds worth, and you'll be fine. Next, we can install our modulator and modulator spring. We've already changed the seals on our modulator and applied a light film of transmission fluid to it, and we put a little bit of assembly lube in the double bore inside. We need to install the piston, push it in all the way in the bore, install our spring. We've put our new sealing ring on the modulator cover and put some assembly lube on that. And now we have our work cut out for us if we don't have the right tool, because now we have to overcome the tension of that spring to put the retaining ring to hold the cover in. By turning the transmission up on its side as we've done here, we can push down on the cover and start the ring in from one edge. With the retaining ring securely seated, the accumulator assembly installation is complete. To reinstall a speedometer gear and retainer, we have to line up the small tab on the bottom of the retainer with the hole in the main shaft. Next, we need to install the speedometer gear so that the keyway engages the retaining clip. If the speedometer gear won't slide on by hand, we'll need something that will contact a large area around the face of the gear so we don't damage it in putting it on. Almost anything will do so long as it encompasses enough area so as not to damage the gear. We not only drive the gear on far enough so that the retaining clip pops up on this side. After inspecting the rear bushing in the extension housing, or replacing it if need be, we need to apply some assembly lube to the bushing, install our new rear seal, same way as we did the torque converter seal, placing it on the housing, using a plate of steel or hard wood, using our hammer, striking it down till it's seated evenly all around. Apply some assembly lube to the relief in the seal, Just actually fill the little void with grease. Install your new sealing ring and apply a film of assembly lube around that. Line up the housing on the main case, move it into position, and install the retaining bolts after lubricating the threads with assembly lube. The extension housing bolt should be brought up the seat by hand and then tightened to specified torque. In the case of the 350 Chevy Trans, that would be 25 foot-pounds. This completes the assembly of our transmission. Due to its tremendous popularity and number, we used the Chevrolet 350 turbo-hydromatic transmission as a visual aid in this production. However, most contemporary automatic transmissions work in the same way. Therefore, most of the procedures and techniques highlighted in this production will also apply to those transmissions. We always stress that you obtain the proper factory service manual for the exact transmission that you intend to build. If you exercise patience and you work carefully, your transmission should reward you with many miles of trouble-free operation.